If you didn't get a copy of Dr. Chasen's book, there's some extras there, so please grab one. I think there might be a couple of latecomers who didn't get one, so yeah.
And he'll autograph them afterwards, yes? Thank you.
$5.
You pay me $5 for your autograph? I'm glad you did it.
Okay, so I got a little bit of a speech here, but not really. Thank you for coming. Welcome. Our meeting tonight, generously sponsored by Musicians Clinics of Canada, purveyors of fine pizza and bubbly drinks. And our section sponsors, I'm going to read them off here because it's a long list. Adamson, Gear Audio, Electrosonics Canada, avshop.ca, Q5X, Solotech, BRTB, Lawo, and Sonotechnique. And we also have support from Toronto Metropolitan University, University of Toronto Faculty of Music, right here, Sheridan College, the Screen Industries Research and Training Center, that's CERT for short, and we have to thank University of Rochester as well, because we frequently, including tonight, use their Zoom and their YouTube facilities, so we're streaming, so you might be internet famous before we're done here. So our presenters tonight are good friends of our section, Steve Armstrong and Dr. Marshall Chasen, and we're really glad to hear them again. They always pack the house, and happily they've done so again tonight. So I think that's about all I have to say. So Steve is going to be our first presenter.
Actually,
Second.
Oh, okay.
we just changed it up. Marshall's going to lead off.
Why wasn't I informed?
And if I hadn't been held up on traffic, we were going to actually blend the presentations together,
okay.
so you wouldn't have to put up with a whole bunch of
Okay.
Marshall and a bunch of me.
Well, then, would you please give a warm Antarctica welcome to Dr. Marshall Chasen.
So the book I gave out is not intended for you guys. It's intended for somebody that doesn't know what they're talking about. Musicians. Sorry.
Musicians.
But it's true, because musicians use different terminology than we do. You know, they use B flat and C sharp. We use whatever in frequency. And we talk about the fundamental. They talk about tonics, and so the jargon's a little bit different. But I give this book. It's a self-published book. So this is actually edition number 6 or 7. 6. I just give it to my musicians, and since about 1990, that's about 30 years now, I've been giving these things out. So there's about 5,000 to 8,000 of those out there someplace. And it's a nice overview of everything. The first chapter is about hearing and hearing loss. Second chapter about the factors affecting hearing loss. The third, fourth, and fifth chapters are kind of what we do about it. And so it's more about hearing loss prevention, not about audio per se. So if you have trouble sleeping tonight, read it. Don't put you to sleep. So Steve and I were, oh, by the way, it's the AES of Antarctica, as Ross pointed out. Do you know why it's called Antarctica? I just found this out. This is trivia. Well, why is the Arctic called the Arctic? I think is a better way of saying it. How many people know Latin? Well, Arctic, a version of that means bear. So Antarctica means no bears. So there's no bears in Antarctica. That's why it's called Antarctica. And why it sounds so similar to Arctic.
Is that your whole presentation?
That's my whole presentation. And it's more.
That's the one thing you're going to learn tonight.
Yeah. Next time we'll find out about geminants and speech and language. Okay. So Steve and I thought what we would do is do some disjointed, a few little tidbit topics. So none of the topics are particularly long. The first one I'm going to be talking about is this tuning fork. And this is actually, by the way, that's what we look like. That's what I look like with my karate gi. I'm trying to get a mean face there. Steve just got back from vacation, so I expected him to look somewhat like that. I'm really good with Photoshop, as you see, and that's me beating up this 5-year-old kid. I'm authorized to beat up 5-year-olds, no problems at all. The 8-year-olds come after you. So the question is, the first of several talks here, is a phone call I get at midnight. And this has happened to me. People call up and said, I've lost my hearing in an ear. What do I do? Go back to bed. Don't piss me off at midnight. But they do call at midnight. So I can't hear in my right ear. Should I come over? And it always happens at midnight. So my response is, oops. Do you happen to have a tuning fork? Everyone should have a tuning fork, right? And they say no. But if they do have a tuning fork, and they have access to a low frequency tuning fork, around 250 hertz, 500 hertz, not much above that, but if you can have lower frequency one or physically larger one, you can do what's called the Weber test. And the Weber test is you cause this to vibrate on your elbow or your knee, and you put it on your forehead. And if you hear it in the center of your head, go back to bed. There's nothing wrong with you. If you hear it, though, in the bad ear, let's say it's the right ear, and you do this and say, should I hear it in my right ear? Go back to bed. It means it's wax or a cold. No emergency, in other words. Call me on Monday, we'll take the wax out. But if you hear it in your good ear, you hear it there, and this is the bad ear, that's serious stuff, and that could be an inner ear hearing loss. That's not something as simple as an ear infection. You have to go to the ER as quickly as you can and get an ear doctor to inject steroids right into your head because it's an unexplained inner ear sensorineural loss. So this is a nice little, handy little thing to have around. I'll pass it around. And if you do hear it in one ear more than the other ear, come and see me after. My clinic is only down the street, so the other side of College Street. So I'll pass that around. So what happens if you don't happen to have a tuning fork with you? How can you guys figure this thing out? Well, this is what I've just described to you as the Weber test. And it will always go to the plugged up ear if the plugging is due to wax or cold. If it goes to the other ear, there's a word for that. Okay, but if it does go to the better ear, prednisone, it's time limited. You don't want to put this off weeks and weeks and weeks. The sooner you get your steroids in your ear, the better it is. Steroids cause swelling decrease. It decreases swelling. And usually hearing loss, the nerve endings, and we have about 15 to 18,000 of them in our ears each year, they swell. And think of them as 15,000 microphones. And when some of those microphones don't work well, it's not a good idea. So if you have steroids in there, at least it reduces the swelling. So what happens if you don't have a tuning fork? Well, this is based on Hallowell Davis's work. And it's worthwhile just very briefly going over what he did in 1951. And he was one of the subjects. He refused to subject anybody to a toxic level of noise without doing it himself. In fact, I met him once in 1980 or 81 when the American Speech and Hearing Association was in Toronto. And the first question I went up to him, this is a very famous guy, said, Dr. Davis, were you one of the subjects? And he said, yes, I was. And he still had a hearing loss caused. This was supposed to be a temporary hearing loss. And it's in the book, both temporary and permanent hearing loss. Chapter 1. Actually, chapter 2. So what he did, though, is that he took some U.S. servicemen, volunteers, and I don't know why anyone would volunteer for this, but he plugged up one ear with putty and then exposed them to a lot of loud noises. So he created a hearing loss in one ear, but not the other ear. So he was able to use one ear as the control for the other ear. And then he gave it, and hopefully, and we've all experienced temporary hearing loss, usually lasts 16 to 18 hours. We go to a rock concert, we get a feedback squeal in our ear, whatever happens. Everything sounds a little bit numb and dull for a few minutes, maybe a few hours. Ringing can last for like 2 or 3 days after, but the hearing loss is measurable for about 15 to 16 hours. So what he did is that he blasted out one ear, but not the other ear. He gave them 2 unmarked knobs. One was frequency, one was sound level. And he said, match the right ear to the left ear. And he went up from the lower frequencies to the mid and to the high. And whenever we're going to have a hearing loss, generally from noise or music, it's going to be around the top end of the piano keyboard, around 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 hertz in that region there. Usually by the time you're at 8,000 or 9,000, it's back to normal again. So hearing loss falls off. It's chapter 1. So what he did is that he asked them to compare the right ear to the left ear. And the lower frequencies, there was a good one-to-one correspondence. As the lower frequency in the good ear increased slightly in pitch, so did the affected ear, because it was still pretty good hearing, and there was a good one-to-one correspondence. But as you got into the last octave or two of the piano keyboard on the right-hand side, as the tone increased in pitch in the good ear, the subjects didn't think it got higher pitched in the bad ear, but instead it got louder. And we call this recruitment. So it was recruiting more nerve endings, but it didn't increase the pitch. So the bad ear became more and more flat relative to the good ear. So this perception of sound that is flat relative to the good ear, or flat compared to how you remembered it, is a hallmark of an inner ear or sensory neural type of hearing loss. And in fact, hearing aids can compensate to that to a certain extent for speech, not very much for music, because the last thing you want to do with music is change the flatness away or change the harmonic structure. But with speech, we can get away with this. So what he did there, with the 10 subjects, he found as the sound got higher and higher pitched into the damaged region, things sounded flat. Now, if somebody comes to my office and they say, something sounds sharp compared to the way I remember it, that's not an ear thing, that must be a brain thing. They may have had a mini stroke or something else going on. But if it's a cochlear or ear-related thing, then things, if they're damaged, are flat. So, knowing what Davis did, we can actually, if you don't have a tuning fork, you can listen to this audio file my son made actually. And it's very simple, it's low tech. What it is, it compares the right ear to the left ear, or if you're listening under earphones, that is. And if you play it loud enough, so if there's going to be damage to the ear, it will usually manifest itself only for the louder sounds. The softer sounds, it might be still pretty healthy. So think of the nerve endings as a microphone that's damaged. For low-level inputs, it can still function fairly well, but for higher-level inputs, it's problematic. So this is low-tech. In fact, you can use this to check the speakers for the earphones on your laptop.
1,000 hertz.
It should be the same. Left, right, should be the same.
63 hertz.
You won't hear it. Oh, you do hear it. Not bad.
125 hertz.
Yeah. Okay, so they're duplicates.
250 hertz.
So when you play it one ear to the other,
500 hertz.
if it's the same, that's cool.
1,000 hertz.
Now we get into the region of damage.
2,000 hertz.
So for you, it should be similar.
4,000 hertz. 8,000 hertz.
So people with a one-sided hearing loss, though, would hear one of those as flatter relative to the other ear. Yeah.
So, like, if I'm blind in one eye, I lose my depth perception.
Yep.
If my hearing is damaged, imbalanced that way, what is that sensation called where I have that imbalance in terms of hearing or frequency perception?
There's no one word we have it. Technically, it's called masking level difference, but all that means in English is that the depth perception analog to hearing would be your inability to hear in noisy places with only one-sided hearing. So you'd see no difference in a quiet one-to-one situation, but in a difficult listening situation, it'll be much more difficult. But we can. There might be other terminology that you're referring to, but
it'd also be a case, I think, analogous-wise, that you're losing some of your spatial cues, because you do need 2 ears to localize properly, unless you have access to visual cues, because your brain will override if it sees a plausible visual source. It'll accept that, and it places a higher weighting on visual input than it does on hearing.
That is true. It's actually very complicated. We don't really know the answers. We do know that in the lower frequencies, we use, my apologies, in the lower frequencies you use wavelength. It hits this ear a moment before this ear. In the mid and higher frequencies, we use intensity differences between the ears, where it hits this head, and the head shadow decreases the sound level by the time it hits this one. So we can use that. But that's normal hearing. But there are many people that are born with only one ear. They just don't have hearing on that side, and they can localize fairly well. In fact, I wrote a document for the Ontario Police Constables selection criteria, they call it. Can you be a cop with only one ear? And the answer is yeah. And we don't fully understand what's happening when a person only has one ear, yet they're pretty good. If the bad guy's over there, they don't look this way. Well, they might, but if they're a really good cop, they'll look that way. I would look that way. If you haven't had a chance with it, artificially plug one ear while you do that. You'll see it should localize to the front.
Go around one more time.
So
Australian tuning fork.
But this is a test. I can give to Ross or whoever, and you can just use it very quickly. But even though it sounded obvious to you that it was the same, people with a one-sided, unexplained hearing loss would hear once that damaged ear as being flat relative to the good ear, and that's right off the bat a very important clue. I use this clinically. I have a piano in my office, actually, where I have people going up in semitones, up the note, and when two adjacent notes do not sound in different pitch, assuming your piano is in tune, that is the region of what we call a cochlear dead region, where there's so much damage to your ear that sometimes less is more. We want to avoid that frequency region at all cost. So that's very important in fitting hearing aids, for example. But we can use it, if somebody calls me up in the middle of the night and says, I can't hear very well.
1,000 hertz.
Quiet. Here. And of course, you can use your own piano, or if you have a signal generator as well, put them through stereo earphones. And again, if you find the damaged ear or the worst ear is a little bit flat relative to the good ear, don't wait. Get yourself to the ER and have somebody stick a needle in your head. It doesn't hurt. It's painless. They numb it up. It's like the dentist. They put cream in there, and so but you don't feel the needle going in. You'll hear it, a thud, but trust me. Okay, so that's my little tidbit on that topic, which is a fairly simple tidbit to have. Now, I'm going to actually back off this next talk because I think I'm going to give Steve a chance. We're going to go back to like Mutt and Jeff, or Laurel and Hardy, whatever it's called. How old am I? You remember Mutt and Jeff, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Rocky and Bullwinkle?
Bullwinkle. Okay, so I will back off of that for a moment.
Okay.
And I think you're on the right side. So,
Why don't you drop that down? Yep.
and that's you over there.
So let's do one slide there. You do it?
Yep.
Perfect. So I'll just find some keys. Perfect. So Marshall gets to do all the clinical stuff, and me being an engineer / scientist guy, I've always got to look at from the physiology side what's going on, because a lot of what we need to do in terms of trying to compensate for hearing difficulties, we have to start with a physiological model and say, what are we going to do? Some of you may be familiar with this. Marshall was talking about, your outer ear sound comes down, hits your eardrum, fancy name, tympanic membrane. It conducts through 3 little bones on its way to this seashell-shaped thing called the cochlea. The cochlea is filled with fluid, so the fact is all sounds we hear are actually underwater. We're not listening. It's no longer air conduction. Once you get past the eardrum, it's simply that. We also have these semicircular canals, and those are also an important sensory thing for our sense of balance. But it's unrelated to hearing, but it typically gets handled by the same ENTs because it's located close to the cochlea.
Are they filled with air?
I'm sorry?
Are they filled with air?
No, they're also fluid filled. There doesn't seem to be a lot of air pockets except for the back side behind your station tube here, which is, this is what collapses when you're changing altitude on an airplane pretty quick. If your station tube's plugged it up, or if you go diving, you can do what's the Valhalla maneuver?
Valsalva.
Thank you. To unplug that. This is also a useful diagram because Marshall passed around the tuning fork. The tuning fork is basically bypassing everything up through here and relying on bone conduction into the cochlea itself to actually produce that sound. So that's why he said if you do that and you hear it, he's bypassed all this stuff where the earwax is going to be, where you might have a middle ear problem, something like that. That's all bypassed. If you can still hear that, bravo. Because even if you do have issues with middle ear bones, that's surgically correctable. And of course, if you have earwax, that's infinitely correctable. Just, hydrogen peroxide, sit on your side, listen to it bubble, it'll drive you nuts. But it works very well. But more importantly, when we take that cochlea and look at a cross section, as I said, it's seashell shaped, and it gets progressively smaller and smaller in diameter. And in each side of those conductive paths, there's actually 2 sections with a membrane in between. And it's this function that is actually quite important, because what actually happens when sound goes in through the oval window, which is the top half, and goes down to the other end and propagates back out through the round window. So sound traveling waves are actually going in both directions through this device. And when you dissect this even a little further here, what you start seeing is, there's a membrane here, and there's another one that's called the tectoral membrane. And it's actually the movement of those two relative to each other that translates into generating neural spikes off these inner hair cells. You also have inner and outer hair cells. Let me just move one slide up. Break that up a little bit more. So the inner hair cells are the ones that actually transduce motion from the stereocili, they're called, the little tiny fibers, when they wiggle back and forth. That causes a change in the calcium potential and allows firing of this to happen, and then through synapses, which connect to neurons, all that goes off to your brain. But also, more importantly, so these are sensory cells, the inner ones. The outer ones are actually motor cells. And we have 3 times as many outer hair cells as we do inner hair cells. And what these ones actually do is they're moving this tectoral membrane around a little bit, which changes the physics in terms of the sensitivity of what goes on. In fact, if I wanted to do a very simple little analogy of this, here's the count, here's some data. Marshall mentioned we have thousands of these hair cells. Well, we do. The sensors, we got about 3,500 in each ear. They're sensory cells. Each cell has the equivalent of 10 neurons coming off it. And the connections are actually the synapses. That's what connects the neurons to the cell itself. And Marshall made an important point that quite often hearing loss, it's an inflammatory process. So when you go out and have acoustic trauma or beat your ears up at a concert and that, you actually get inflammation happening at the cellular level. And the problem with that is the inner hair cells grow up, but then as they shrink down, sometimes some of the synapses get a bit fragile. And there used to be a time that we figured that inner hair cells were quite fragile. It turns out we now are starting more late to think that they're actually not too bad. It's the synapses that are the big problem. So it's the little connections that are the worst guy in this counter. So opposite that, we got 12,000 motor cells. And there, as I said, they're going to make adjustments to the physics within the cochlea. And what you can sort of think of it as is when the stereocili are sitting there at rest, the neurons have a certain spike pattern. And a neuron is either fired or not fired. It's a 1-bit system. Bang, bang, bang. And these things will spontaneously fire. But depending on the deflection of the stereocili, it starts changing the density and the pattern of those spikes. So it's sort of like the deflection of this is modulating the pulse density, as it were, coming out of our physiology. And that's all in response to motion of the stereocili. So if I put on my engineering hat, which I love doing, gotta have a schematic. The eardrum is like a microphone. The outer hair cells are nature's preamp. They're the automatic gain control, because I said they're motors. So they actually move in response to intensity, not on an instantaneous level, but over a longer term. And then we have nature's ADC, which is the inner hair cells. It has a relatively poor dynamic range of about 10 bits, 60 dB dynamic range. And as many of you know, we're capable of hearing over 120 dB dynamic range. Well, how does that happen? Well, what nature's AGC does, automatic gain control, is it changes that gain. So it moves that A to D around for us. So what happens when you start losing these outer hair cells, you start losing that gain function. And that gets expressed as elevated thresholds for hearing. It takes higher sound levels. The preamp gain got turned down, it's broke, you're screwed. And thus it goes. Well, that's sort of a very simplistic view, just looking at based on a single location, but let's take this cochlea, which is wrapped up, and unwrap it. I mentioned earlier it's tapered, and its volume is decreasing as we go over the distance. And what's kind of interesting about this, the way the physics lines up, there are best frequencies all along here where things want to happen. So the high frequency stuff happens at the input side of things, and the low frequencies actually get detected best at the apex. So you sort of have this physiology filter that's spreading everything out in the frequency domain. So we do have a bit of a frequency analyzer going on. And then in each region here, as we said, we had 3,500 inner hair cells. Well, if you think about it as being like, say, a third octave filter bank, you're talking 100 inner hair cells in 1/3 octave. And even though they're very coarse, if you start looking at it statistically, it starts building up. So maybe a better model is actually to think of, roughly we have 3rd octave filter banks, and don't take this religiously because we're not perfect on the log scale. If we talk about something called equal bands, loudness, contours, as well as the whole idea of a critical band, which a critical band is if you start with a very narrow band noise and start expanding the width of that noise, the loudness will continue increasing up to a certain point, and then it doesn't increase anymore. So that's the critical band is you have loudness summation within a narrow band. Down at low frequencies below 1K, all these bands are about a constant 100 hertz wide, roughly. Above 1K, then it does start spreading itself in a log scale. But let's just keep it simple. 3rd octave analyzer. So perhaps a better model is really, you've got the eardrum going through the middle ear to a cochlear filter bank, which is arranged in these, does spectral decomposition, followed by a whole bunch of A to D preamps in conjunction with A to Ds. Now I said there was 3,500 inner hair cells, and if each one of those has 10 neurons, ultimately, you're looking at 35,000 one-bit A to D representations. So per ear. So this is a massively parallel system that you have all these little neuron spikes propagating up to the auditory context, ultimately to the auditory cortex, but they first arrive at the brainstem at the back. So physiologically, this is sort of an engineering view of what I see on it. The challenge becomes, the scanning electron microscope here shows, this was from a chinchilla, and in the back row here, you can see the stereocyli from the inner hair cells, and then we can see these 3 rows of outer hair cell stereocyli. The hair cells themselves, the body is below the membrane, as we said. But so this is a healthy cochlea. Unfortunately, if you go the wrong way, you lose the effect. Bad things can happen to good hair. Marshall, comment?
I don't know what you're talking about.
So in this particular one, we've lost outer hair cells, a lot of annihilation on the outer hair cells, on the outer hair cells as well as the inner. So this is the sort of thing when Marshall's talking about coming out and playing all the notes and things don't change. It's because as you're going across there, it kind of, you can have these dead regions.
Are those hair cells attached at the top?
Well, they're actually lightly touching the tectoral membrane. So there is a deflection that happens.
And the other 3 rows, they're not.
Those ones are actually embedded in the tectoral membrane and moving it up and down to change its physical displacement. Because remember, these are motor hair cells,
Yeah.
which change mechanical gain before nature's aid.
So in this chinchilla, did they take off the upper layer? Or just...
Oh yes, it's been surgically taken off.
Okay.
Sorry. I'd like to say it was my ear, but I can hear perfectly
No,
well.
I
above
actually,
it.
I actually have a bunch of those slides too.
Yeah.
I was curious.
So that's sort of it in a nutshell. And the whole challenge in the hearing loss space is how do we compensate for nature's ADC being broken? So we've lost the gain control. Well, so we can amplify quiet sounds. That's great. But what do we do about loud sounds? We don't need amplification. We got to turn the gain down. So that's one of the biggest signal processing strategies is automatically trying to compensate for these guys being broken. As I said, we used to think these guys were quite sensitive, but all we know right now is it's the synapses that are more suspect in terms of being the culprit from inflammation. And some of the experiments sadly show that using animal models, and animal models being code for we did experiments on animals, that you can actually lose a lot of synapses and still have a normal threshold of hearing quiet. There is a possibility that without any damage here, you could lose synapses, have a normal threshold for hearing in quiet for pure tones, but have a miserable time in noisy places because you've lost so. What it really says is you don't need a very good A to D to perceive a tone, right? That tone is a very poor signal for really judging things. So you had a question.
So you're saying inflammation plays a large factor.
Yeah.
To simplify here, would something like arthritis exacerbate that as opposed to physical injury?
Yep, diabetes is a biggie, arthritis, any inflammatory process, overeating. actually the NIH, the National Institutes for Health in the U.S., which is very high caliber. Amphasia, oddphage is the word. It's an unusual word, but it says that if you starve yourself for 2 days, you will actually significantly reduce swelling in all the cells of your body, and you will function better until you starve to death. Autophage.
So if you have a client that has perceived notch filtering, they can't hear whatever range, and they do a simple test, like starving yourself for 2 days, a fast, which is a trend amongst some. In theory, with the inflammatory reduction in inflammation within the body, they could have enhanced hearing, have some of this hearing loss come back.
Very small. No, I think there are about 10 factors affecting the ear. Inflammation is one of them, but it's the only one. And cells respond to trauma and toxicity by being inflamed, but it's not that a generalized inflammatory process such as rheumatoid arthritis or even diabetes would have any long-term effects. So these people might function a little bit better in noise, but until they start eating again. So I wouldn't suggest you do that. It's called autophage, that's the word. AUTOPHAGE.
It turns out that this cochlea is kind of bad design from one aspect in terms of the blood flow. It's actually quite sensitive to changes in blood flow, so any restrictions in that, which makes it very sensitive to destruction. One of the experiments they have done historically, I know somebody who's involved in this, if you take aspirin in high enough doses, it'll actually inhibit the outer hair cell function. You can give yourself a hearing loss, and then once you flush out of that, it'll come back. But it's very high doses. You're talking grams per kilogram of body weight.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a little worried because at the time they didn't really realize the synapse thing, so I just get worried that there could be collateral damage from some of that. So that was sort of the pitch as Marshall. So there, we use pure tone audiogram to describe our ability to hear very quiet sounds. And by the way, the threshold of the hearing is only the quietest you hear something 50% of the time, not 100% of the time. In the test, you go up, down, you straddle it, and then you take the average of the last couple and say, there you go, there's the 50 percentile. And it can change day to day. What's more interesting, I think, is the condition of some of the inner hair cells, because those are super threshold. We don't do a lot of listening rate at threshold. As we age, we'll also be more subject to tinnitus. A lot of people have probably got a little bit of tinnitus starting. Also not a good sign, because that implies that the neural spikes are not getting up to the brain. We could talk about that at length. There's some interesting models on that. But one of the things is there's a very time-consuming test to try and identify these dead regions called the 10 test. And I think what Marshall's solution, which is just go to the piano and go up and up and up, is way quicker, way quicker. Find the two that don't match. And then let's suppose that's at that region. Plop in a notch filter, because take that energy out of there, because it only adds confusion and distortion to the perceived signal. And you can do a fairly high Q notch to take it out. Mathematically, it doesn't consume a lot of current, easy to do. A lot of the products, unfortunately, don't necessarily have a bank of notch filters at disposal for fitting. Anyhow, back to Marshall.
The converse of what Steve said was also true, by the way, that if you can lose up to 90% of your inner hair cells, 90%, and still have a normal hearing threshold. Now, as Steve pointed out, you wouldn't hear very well in a noisier place, but that's the idea behind cochlear implants. So people that are quite profoundly deaf and they have replacement electrodes, they might put an electrode in there with up to 22 electrodes. There might be 8 or 10 ones that are viable that you can turn on some current to. So you've replaced, essentially going inwards, you've replaced about 3,000 nerve endings with maybe 8 or 10. And people still do fairly well, especially in quiet. In noise, it's a bit problematic. But so there's a lot of redundancy in the auditory system. Thanks, Steve. Now, tell me, we're going to be going back and forth. I have 2 talks. This one, which is maybe a minute and a half, well, 5 minutes. And then I have another one which is 30 minutes, which is similar to what I give to the National Youth Orchestra, where I go there every summer. These are talented kids. And I just, that's more about hearing loss prevention. So do you have a preference one way or the other? I know it's hot in here, so I don't want to.
Is doing both or just one?
There's the air conditioner unit right there.
Yeah, I can do both, especially if Steve can turn on the air conditioner.
Yeah.
Well,
No,
let
that's
me
just an air filter.
I'll speed through
Actually, if
this.
it's gotten quieter outside,
It's got water.
we can do this.
I feel so cool now. So yeah, let me dwell on this for a second. This won't take too long. This is my more favorite topic lately because I just wrote a book last year called Music. Excuse me. Pardon me. My apologies. Music and hearing aids. And hearing. So we know a lot about speech into hearing aids. We don't know a lot, but we do know more every day about music and hearing aids. And so I wrote a book last year, or 2022. My apologies. Don't buy it. It's a good book, but it's a textbook. So if anyone's interested, just email me later and I'll send you a PDF of it. Also on my website there, the audio files which are embedded in the real book, you can pull off my website as well. So I'll give you that information before you leave. But just to give you a sense of what's happening here, when hearing aids became digital in the early 1990s, it took a major step backwards. In some sense, we had pretty well solved many of the problems with music and hearing aids. In 1988, Meade Killian had come out with a circuit called the K-amp. He likes to name things after himself, K for Killian. And this was a 1988 circuit, which was the mainstay for all my musicians in the late 80s and early 90s. And then all of a sudden, hearing aids became digital, and they used a front-end analog to digital conversion system that was 16 bits, but functioned poorly even at that. And usually sounds over about 85 or 90 decibels were distorted on input into this processing. So the processing was receiving, from music, highly distorted input. Speech being down here is not that big of an issue, but not only is music up here, but another factor is up here. A hard of hearing person's own voice was very close to the microphone. And even though the level of my own voice at a meter or two might be about 60, 65 decibels, it sure isn't 60 or 65 decibels here. It's closer to 90, and then we have peaks. So that we've had a whole generation of hard of hearing people wearing these early digital hearing aids in the 90s and 2000s, and even today, actually. There are some hearing aids in the market that just cannot handle the higher levels of input. So what I want to just do is kind of show you that. So this is a simulation, how we can change the front end of a hearing aid, and what we've had to do, I'll talk about in a moment, as a hearing aid industry over the years. So think of the input into the hearing aid. So I'm not talking about the output into the ear, just getting past the microphone to the analog to digital conversion stage at the front end. So this is speech. Both of these auditory signals are with a maximum input of 115, 105, 95, which is typical of many 16-bit systems, and back to 115. Why 115? Many modern hearing aids have microphones that are distortion-free with inputs up to 115. In fact, recently with MEMS microphone, it's even a little bit better, up to maybe 119 dB SPL input without distortion. So this is the paradigm.
One day, when Pip was considerably older, Uncle Pumblechook brought Mrs. Joe word that a Miss Havisham, a lady who lived in his own town, had heard of Pip and wanted him to come to her house to see her.
105.
One day, when Pip was considerably older, Uncle Pumblechook
Speech is quiet,
brought Mrs.
so
Joe
no
word that a Miss Havisham, a lady who lived in his own town, had heard of Pip and wanted him to come to her house to see her.
95.
One day, when Pip was considerably older, Uncle Pumblechook brought Mrs. Joe word that a Miss Havisham, a lady who lived in his own town, had heard of Pip and wanted him to come to her house to see her. One day, when Pip was considerably older, Uncle Pumblechook
No
brought
difference.
Mrs. Joe
Maybe your
word
speech is
that a
relatively
Miss
quiet.
Havisham, a lady who lived in his own town, had heard of Pip and wanted him to come to her house to see her.
So that's speech at about 65 dB, roughly RMS, about a meter or a meter and a half, depending on the acoustics of the room. Music, however, this is 90 dB music, so this isn't just music in your car, although it can be that loud, especially if there's a lot of background and your roof's down and you're on the highway and you're zooming along behind an ambulance. We won't talk about anyone there. So same paradigm, 115, 105, 95, and back to 115. So 105. Okay. 95. Clicked.
Bit of compression there.
And with that as input, you can't do anything. So. And the new 8s have a little bit more headroom for that. Yeah, so sounds good. So if the music sounds that distorted on the input, no amount of fancy dancy signal processing that's done later in the system will get rid of that. Short of just having low pass filter everything, get rid of all the harmonics, but you won't hear
But
anything.
Marshall, there are actually radio stations that generate that kind of sound.
Yes, there are. Are we talking about Jazz FM? We won't talk about Jazz FM right now.
Okay.
But yeah. So how is and let me just
One day when Pip was
so how has the hearing industry responded? It's kind of clever how some of the things they've done in the early 2000s and even are doing today. Well, the first thing is that this is more of a diagnostic cue. If you have a hearing aid and you turn down the input to the hearing aid, let's say you're at home and you're stereo, maybe you're in your car, you turn down the volume streaming to your hearing aid, either auditorily or Bluetooth, and if necessary, turn up the volume on your hearing aid. It's like ducking under the bridge. So they think of that as a low-hanging bridge to get to the other side. And if that works, if that's better than having higher volume and turning down the volume of the hearing aid, that tells me the hearing aid has a front end that is distorting with the inputs to the music. So that can be used as a diagnostic indicator. Another strategy that a lot of manufacturers have been using, first started with Resound, interestingly enough, which is a hearing aid manufacturer. And interestingly enough, they're the only ones that don't use it now. And there's some reasons for that. But they would run off the preamp of the microphone and an analog signal to turn it into a compressor. So they would essentially duck under the bridge, digitize it, then expand it later on the other side is the short form. So it's a ducking under the bridge, and that's pretty clever. Another one, some companies like Widex likes to use what's called a voltage multiplier, where it gives you a bit more, up to 6 dB more headroom on the input before any distortion. And recently, most manufacturers have gone to a post-16-bit architecture. So they've gone to 18 or 19 or 20 bits even. It's arguable exactly how loud it is, but a combination of the preamp, analog compressor running off of it, with maybe some other strategies with a voltage multiplier. I'm not too sure if any manufacturer is using what they call stacked A to Ds, but some of them still do, because I know the supplier to the industry is still selling those to somebody, although I can't get the answer who they're selling it to, but they are being sold. So there have been a lot of really clever approaches. Yeah.
Is there a frequency shape that can be taken advantage of so that you would pre-analog filter for digitizing? And
I don't
then
know. I don't think so, but that's an engineering question. Steve?
I'm going to say no, because if our goal was just to amplify speech, then yes. But typically when we get into louder environments, those aren't speech. You listen to music, you've got other environmental, which can have high bandwidth.
You want to know the spectrum in advance.
Yeah. But I like where you were going and doing a pre-emphasis and then the old analog tape stuff, right? Pre-emphasis, post-emphasis. Yeah. Same with vinyl, I guess. Same.
Okay. So one of the reasons Resound stopped using that is that they have this technology where Steve and Betty Rue had a patent about 30 years ago, almost?
No, 20.
20. Time does fly.
22 to be exact, because the patent expired 2 years ago.
Okay, but the idea behind it is that the microphone and the loudspeaker, what we call the receiver, were very spaced adjacent to each other. And they were getting some feedback that they couldn't control with it, so they had to get rid of that approach. But the idea of having a little bit of compression prior to the A to D makes a lot of sense, and a lot of manufacturers just consider that good engineering design. So these are all, to my ear, very ingenious. To you guys probably know it as second nature. But that's how the industry has responded. Some manufacturers are better than others. As a rule of thumb, if you're ever going to get a hearing aid or know someone that wants to get a hearing aid for louder things like your own voice or music, usually the top two rungs of their technology level will work. Frequently, the bottom rung does not work, and that's because many manufacturers get that from a third-party supplier. So Oticon, and Oticon's perhaps one of the largest companies in the world in the hearing aid space, they're very honest about this, and they say music will work with this level and this level, but it won't work with this level, meaning that they got that level from another company. They didn't want to spend any of their effort manufacturing, and this is fairly common in the hearing aid industry, some companies more than others. Interestingly enough, historically, sometimes the lowest level one worked better than the higher level one. A company called Unitron was famous for that. And that's because their lowest level one, that third-party company, was a circuit that Steve actually worked on. I think they called it Wolverine now.
Yeah.
They had a special thing called the HRX, headroom expander. Is that the?
Yep.
Yeah, thank
I'll
you.
talk about that.
Oh, great. Where the input can actually have a detector, and it would actually go up and down so that the ADD converter will always be within the optimal range of that. And so that was bought as a third-party hearing aid that they spent relatively little on it compared to their in-house product, but it functioned better than their in-house products. And that was a source of embarrassment for a lot of manufacturers. So it can work both ways. So that just gives you kind of an insight into what goes on under the hood and behind closed doors in the hearing aid space. Now I'm going to stop and give to Steve. The one last thing I have is a talk on hearing loss prevention, and it's about 30 minutes, so that's completely your choice whether you want me to do that or not.
Absolutely.
But let's do that one after. I'll do a segment.
Yeah, yeah.
The next segment I was going to do ties nicely with what you just completed.
Oh, should I just should be, oh, thank you.
Oh, actually, there it is.
No,
it's still open, I think.
hearing.
Cool. Thank you.
So if I'd made it here in time, this would have all been integrated into one, and that back to Marshall was a cue for him to put it in the slide deck at that spot. So Marshall's talked nicely about the whole front end problem, and here's a magnified picture of a typical hearing aid type microphone, metal can, 3 connectors. You put ground, supply, and you have your output signal. The left-hand side over here, this is actually the sound port where sound comes in. And in cross-section, this is how they work. I mentioned the sound port. That actually comes through a hole, comes into what's called the front chamber, the front volume. And separating the front and back is a mylar diaphragm. And it's been aluminized, so it's a conductive layer, very thin layer of aluminum sitting on there. And then there's a back plate in here because we're going to make a capacitor type microphone. It's a condenser mic. But unlike the studio mics where you guys bring in 48 volt phantom and that gets turned into 60 volts or whatever the mic guys wants to do, the original hearing aid stuff was all electric mics. In fact, that was a major breakthrough in the whole hearing aid space, as originally these were magnetic microphones, moving coil type designs. It was when electrets came around. Now, the whole point of a capacitor microphone is one side moves, the other side doesn't. If you have a fixed amount of charge, that movement turns into voltage. Okay, so you just need charge. Well, electret is just a nice name for a fancy material that holds electrons in its place that don't leak off. We call it Teflon. It literally is Teflon in the hearing aid space, and they'll polarize these back plates up to the equivalent of about 20 volts, and then from there, it's a very high impedance system, just like any studio condenser mic. So you've got, in the electric days, they're all junction FETs that were used for buffer impedances, because at this node here, you want as many gigohms of impedance as you can, because that's what makes the noise nice and low. It's sort of ironic. This is actually all integrated in there, but the noise floor A weighter is about 25 dB scale, so certainly noisier than what you would get in a good studio mic. And the reason for that has everything to do with diaphragm area. The bigger the diaphragm, the lower the noise. And that's no different in your condenser mics, whether you got a large diaphragm or a small diaphragm. They're going to have different noise floors, and it's just got to do with the physics and the averaging of the motion of the air molecules. On the other end of it, they'll tolerate 120 dB SPL sine wave, and I put pure tone up here because some people like sine waves, some people like pure tones. In the audiology world, I say a sine wave, and they're going, what? Oh, pure tone. Yeah, okay, now I know what you mean. So it's important to stress that this is not 120 dB music. This is 120 dB pure tone. So you got to back off your realistic input by the crest factor. And to jump to that message, it doesn't matter whether it's music or speech, crest factor is about 20 dB. So basically these microphones can function fairly decently into an environment up to about 100 dB SPL. So this is one of the challenges, is that we use pure tones for a lot of testing. That's what even studio mics, that's how they rate their overload points. Their acoustic overload points are all done with pure tones, but your mileage will definitely vary. In a realistic hearing aid, though, we talked a little bit about the microphone, ADC. I've left off the preamp. We digitize things. We do a bunch of math on it. We spit it back out. I've tried to capture the bits in terms of what kind of circuitry. There's actually a lot of analog circuitry in here. Like the microphones are analog. The preamps are analog. About 90% of the ADC process is analog. So it needs about 200 microamps in total. It's about 150 microamps in the ADC itself. So, and 150 microamps at 1 volt, 1.2 volts. So it's about 150 microwatts. You can use microamps and microwatts interchangeably. There's a little bit of analog current on the back end, but where I was really trying to set up for is the fact that with that front end where I've said you've already got a preamp ADC, that 150 microamps will give us about 80 to 84 dB dynamic range. So starting to flirt, you take 80 divided by 6, you're at, geez, my math is not, 24. Thanks, 14-bit. We're at about 14 bits of performance. And then the problem that I just said is the microphone can go from 25 dB SPL to 120. But if I've only got an 80 dB dynamic range, just to keep it simple here, I've got to have the noise floor of that A to D be a little bit less if I want to preserve that input referred noise at 25 dB. So I've got to give up, I actually just took off 5 dB, which means it's 100 dB that it's going to overload at. And you can see we're leaving all this headroom on the table. And this is what Marshall said, when the hearing aid industry went from analog, where we were taking really good care of the signal coming out of the microphone, to the first digitals where you needed this A to D, the performance was subpar. This is what you were looking at. And everybody said, well, that's not a problem because the highest these things are going to see is 90 dB. Why would you say that? Well, every single hearing aid product gets tested. It gets put in an acoustic test chamber and tested. A whole bunch of standardized tests that have to be done in order to meet Health Canada and FDA and the state's regulatory region testing. The highest stimuli level is a 90 dB pure tone. So when the industry transitioned over to digital, there was a lot of people that I want to call newcomers to the field. They said, well, the only thing we got to handle is 90, so we'll do it. So you got a bunch of product that tests fine in a test box, but doesn't do so well in the real world. Along this side, what I wanted to highlight is there's this horrible problem in analog, and I call it the halfback rule. If you double the amount of current in an A to D, you're only going to see about a 3 dB improvement in signal to noise ratio. And I say halfback because doubling is 6 dB. I add 6 dB of current, I get 3 dB more SNR. Double it again. You can see very quickly this current's climbing. And you go, well, what's so wrong with 2.4 milliwatts? Well, when you got a battery that's supposed to last the whole day, you can't do this. You can't go down this road. And so one of the things you can do, and you'll see this in audio interfaces that you guys are probably seeing in your studio setups and that, where the dynamic range is sitting quite nicely, 120 dB, thereabouts. It's feasible to do that, but you got to throw milliwatts, lots of milliwatts at it to get that level. There is another trick that you can do. If you actually take 2 A to Ds, the same performance, and run them in parallel, you double the current, and you do get the 3 dB improvement. So some of the highest end converters, because if I scan technology and I do watch this, the highest single A to D dynamic range I'm seeing is about 121 dB. So 20-bit performance. Even though it spits out 32-bit words, it doesn't really matter, it's 120 dB. That A to D comes on a chip with 7 other friends. And one of the modes you can run that chip in is run all those A to Ds in parallel. So you go to 2 A to Ds, you pick up 3, go to 4, you pick up 6 dB, run them in 8, you pick up 9 dB. What was 121 dB dynamic range just became 130, but you're throwing a lot of power at it. You can do that when you're plugging stuff into the wall. You can't do it in a hearing aid. So we had to be a little more clever. And if you remember the talk, this 80 dB dynamic range is more dynamic range than the inner hair cells have. So what can we learn? Well, one of the things that's in here is what if we took that preamp that was in there and we turned down the gain? That would move up. We can line up the headroom there and just bring the noise floor up to 40 dB SPL. Now we've got a noise problem. But we've tackled a headroom problem. And this is what some of the manufacturers are doing for their music programs. It's because any good DSP available in the hearing aid space has got programmable preamp gains. And so you can make that decision. So when you toggle between a different program, you just change the preamp gain and you can have the headroom. Or you can go a little further. What if you got smart and as you change the preamp gain in the digital domain, you did an attenuator at the same time by the same amount. So increased by 5 dB, turned down by 5 dB. The overall gain has stayed the same, but what you're basically doing is moving that A to D, that dynamic range around, and that is precisely what, that's not looking encouraging. Oh, there we go. And then this is exactly what this one patent idea had done, is it took it a step further and says, hey, for those who've done any digital signal processing, you know that if you shift by 1 bit to the left, if you left shift, you're multiplying by 2. 2 in dB is 6.02 dB. If you shift to the right, you're dividing by 2. You can shift. You can do multiplication very, very low power by just doing shifts. And that trick is what was done in this HRX patent. I thought that was the one you were referring to, Marshall, when I said it expired 2 years ago. We just made it, the analog gains change in 6 dB steps. It's synchronized everything. And all this sampling rate, by the way, is all done at 128 kilohertz sampling rate. And then immediately gets downsampled to like 32 or 16K, depending on what the algorithm wants. So bandwidth that's one of the things in digital hearing aids that has improved over time. When they first came out, you were doing really good if the sampling rate was 16K. A lot of them were a little less than that. It's crept up 30. I would say that there's only one of the 5 majors that's still not at 24 kilohertz or higher sampling rate. So there is some opportunities in bandwidth, potentially improve it.
Just a question.
Yep.
When you're dealing with those sampling rates, is it like you're talking about 1 or 2 cycles between input and output, or like how many clock cycles?
Delays?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, okay. So one of the things that really counts in hearing aid world is delay. You want that time from analog into the microphone to analog out of that receiver to be as low as possible. Especially if you're going to do something fancy like put a microphone down the ear canal and do some active noise canceling and things like that. On Semi, who had been a big part of many years, has to this day still has an open platform that will do 48 microseconds from analog in to analog out. So it is quite feasible to actually do some of these real-time feedback loops. Now, most hearing aid algorithms have way more delay than that, because what most of the algorithms do is they bring the signal in and they do an FFT because they want to do all the work in the frequency domain. Well, the problem if you're going to do a 256-point FFT, sounds relatively crude, but it's not an uncommon number. You got to wait, well, and they'll literally be overlapped by 50% for lower distortion. So if the first sample shows up, you got to wait for 127 of its friends to show up before you can start processing. And then on the back end, you got the same delay. So you're into, if you're doing a 256-point FFT-based filter bank, you're looking at 256 audio samples. Now you're talking 8 milliseconds. You're getting up there.
Holy, that's huge.
It is. It's a
That's
problem.
massive.
Well, it is a problem And I can tell you a little interesting story that one of the first, well, it was actually Rezon that you spoke of earlier. Their first digital product is 13 millisecond latency because there have been some evidence that anything below 20 milliseconds was fine. It's not. If there is any chance of you hearing your own voice, oh, hang on, this is a hearing aid microphone and voice, you can't tolerate 20 millisecond latency. They actually had to retool the whole thing, get it down to sub 8 millisecond to get acceptable sound quality. There's still room for improvement because there is still comb filtering that happens because many of today's hearing aids have the amplified path as well as a passive path in there. So there's some opportunities there. But unlike any of you using audio interfaces and trying to do real-time plugins and Pro Tools or whatever, there is no real buffering going on. An audio sample shows up, you just put it down the pipeline. It's not like a Windows operating system where you've got, an ASIO drive with 64 samples of buffer that you're waiting for so you can put it down a USB pipeline and recover it on the other end. It's all the same chip. It's like sample out, start processing. Give me 127 more of those. Or if you want to do everything in the time domain, then you'll be done in a couple audio samples, possibly. So I mentioned the electret mics was the big one, and we put these electrons on the Teflon. The challenge with that is if you heat these microphones up, those electrons leak away, and once they're gone, the microphone's dead. This was a problem because the cell phone guys hate manually soldering. The hearing aid stuff all used to be manually soldered. Well, today it's all MEMS microphones. And a smattering of the electret ones, they're all capacitor, they're still condenser, the same principle. So here's the microphone diaphragm, it's all etched in silicone. It's sitting there floating, it can vibrate back and forth. Instead of using JFETs for the buffering, we'll use CMOS devices, and you run them in sub-threshold, there's ways to get the noise down. But because we no longer have the electrons trapped in Teflon, we need a source of polarizing voltage. So there's a little charge pump on there that can run up, generate the 20 volts, away you go. One of the things that I'd like to see, and I've tried planting this idea into a few people's heads, there's two predominant manufacturers for these, one in the States and one in Denmark, is give me access to that voltage, because there are times that I would like to desensitize that microphone, because 120 sine wave is not enough for a drummer banging on a snare drum. So you can't, if you're going to try and build a cool linear monitor which has ambient mics built into it at this level, and this was done, we learned the hard way, standard hearing aid mics are okay on everybody except the drummer. Fortunately, the electric guys already had stuff that was 10 dB desensitized, so you had a higher noise floor. There was ways we were able to work with it. It was fine. So it would be nice to be able to change the headroom dynamically. That would be probably the next frontier. It's not going to be that hard to do. There are some of these microphones, I'm not aware of anybody doing a PDM, so pulse density modulation, where the A to D, or half the A to D process is embedded in here. You'll see that in the cell phone industry, because what comes out of this is still an analog signal. And all analog signals are subject to RF interference, and all kinds of gremlins can get into your signal, especially when they're not differential. They're single-ended. So you got to be very careful about the routing of that. The cell phone guys are loving these PDM mics where they put the sigma delta modulator inside of here. And so you get a 1-bit stream out of there at 128 times oversampled. So it's all digital, so it's a little more robust. Problem is the dynamic range you're stuck with. And I haven't seen any of them hit that 80 dB dynamic range yet. So, but for cell phones, that's fine because you've got a proximity here. The SNR is usually not a big problem. The other thing about silicon mics that's kind of neat is you can make them really, really small. The problem is that makes them noisier, as we talked about. Same analog trick where you double, you put two A to Ds in parallel, you get 3 dB more dynamic range. If you put two identical MEMS mics together, the noise floor will go down 3 dB. So what some of the manufacturers are doing, I've seen 4 of these inside of one can. Mm-hmm. And actually what was really clever about this guy, because I talked to him when Knowles was doing this, and he took it a notch further, because the microphones, because that diaphragm is a mass, you're a little bit sensitive to vibration. can imagine that if you're moving it back and forth, that diaphragm's got a little bit of a lag on it, so you get a signal for motion. And you say, who cares about vibration? Turns out in hearing aid, you care about it because you got a speaker located in the same package, and you get vibration coming back through the plastic case back to the microphone. And so the hearing aid manufacturers will put transducers orthogonal so the moments of vibration cancel out that. Well, what Knowles had done is they actually took 2 diaphragms at the top, 2 of them upside down, put them together, and it canceled out. Not only did the noise cancel out, the vibration canceled out wonderfully well. So, yeah. So the other thing that's really nice about the MEMS mics is they are so well matched. So well matched. Like, you can do directional processing, very simple. Just you can grab any 2 from the same lot, and they're going to be matched. And one of the challenges of the electret mics is the mylar is hydrophobic. And that moisture changes the sensitivity. In fact, you can breathe on these things, you can see the polar pattern change. It'll stabilize over time. The silicon mics, not a problem. They're beautiful. We talked about changing the sensitivity by changing the voltage, gives us the headroom. So, Marshall, back to you. How are we doing time?
It's 8:03, 8:05.
So if you go, we're probably going to take a break, as we usually do, I assume.
We ate. We can take a break if you want to take a break. Take a 5-10 minute bio break.
Well, I was going to suggest, why don't we go through Marshall's thing here?
I'll have you out of here by 8:37.
Okay. And then yeah.
No, we'll take a brief break just
It's
to.
just the 2 of you, so you tell us when you're out of information, because I know
No.
you're an never out of information. Like, I got a gavel.
256 gigabyte drive.
Oh,
Unfortunately, not all the presentations are on there, turned out.
8:45 will shut down.
Sounds good.
Oh,
Actually,
great.
it's interesting. The whole field is moving so quickly. In 2016, just going through from an analog to digital and digital to analog without any signal processing was 5 or 6 milliseconds. Now, as Steve pointed out today, it's 1/100th of that, about almost 50 microseconds. So it's really improved dramatically. And there are some hearing aids that have special.
Can be.
There are some hearing aids that have special circuitry that if you turn off all the other stuff like noise reduction, it can get down there. Widex has one, Oticon has one, a few of the other ones do, as long as you turn off some of the other features that are more time consuming in hearing aids. So it's kind of it's a neat field actually. So what I'd like to do is just ditch this. That's not good. Ditch that. And turn on this one here. And so this is a similar talk that I give to the National Youth Orchestra. I've been working with them since the early 1990s. And these are really talented people, 1/3 of whom end up in symphony orchestras somewhere in North America. These are, I shouldn't have said the word talented. I'm trying to get rid of the word talented from my vocabulary because it's insulting. Like, these guys work their butts off, and to say, oh, they're talented, and it's dismissive. These are hardworking people that have something, I don't know what it is, but talented. Yeah, we need another word. Accomplished. Oh, I like that.
Musical genius.
Musical genius, yeah. But they work hard. I do have a website that has a lot of this information on it. A couple of years ago, by the way, I did give the keynote lecture to the American Auditory Society in Scottsdale, Arizona. Actually, the guy that was invited had to bail off, so they kind of threw me at the last moment. But we won't talk about that.
He was being deposed.
He was being deposed, yeah. But the issue is that in 1 hour, I talked all about hearing aids and music as the input to hearing aids, which is different than speech as an input to hearing aids. And on this website, if you scroll over to the demo section and then go down to the video, the first video is a 1 hour video of the American Auditory Society. It's very nice. It has some embedded auditory files, audio files that would be useful. But we do have FAQs in this thing, publications, videos, and tool sections. So it's a fun website to spend a couple of hours with. Plural for the word musicians, plural for the word clinics. And if anyone's interested in getting a hold of me after, just go info@musiciansclinic.com. clinics.com will get you directly to me. And I can send, if you're interested, a PDF copy of this. If you prefer PDF, I can send you a PDF of the book that I wrote last year. Just don't tell anyone. We have to start with this guy. Now, this is an age issue, a generation gap thing. Okay, most of you know who this guy is. That's Peter Colombo. He had that detective show in the 1970s, and he would always investigate a crime, and then he would walk away, and then he would come back and say, "Oh, one more thing," and you knew that one more thing was going to come back and haunt the bad guy at the end of the show. Now, if you're under the age of 40, this is the grandfather of The Princess Bride. So there's an age issue here, which is the best movie. And he's even involved in Star Trek in solving a crime there. So he's been everything. So what is the question that I'm talking about? Well, I see somebody, they maybe have a hearing aid from us, or I've done a hearing test on them, they've gone out to the elevator, I said, good, it's done, I'm finished. And then she comes back. She says, oh, one more thing. Well, what is this one more thing? Should I buy an iPod or an MP3 player for my son or granddaughter or whatever for Christmas time? So let's just briefly talk about that to dismiss this, because we all have portable music in our smartphones or whatever. There's something called the 80-90 rule for MP3s. Brian Flegor and also Corey Portnoff did a lot of work on this. And it's a highly variable situation, because it turns out that it's not so much the volume, it's not so much which MP3 player you have, but it has to do mostly with the earphone that you use. And of course, many people buy these devices, throw away the earphones, and use some of their own earphones. So all bets are off. You can't have on the package that volume 3 will be 90 decibels and volume 4 will be 102 decibels. It depends on the earphone that you use. So what Brian Flegor did is that he looked at a whole bunch of different ones and different earphones and tried to come to some sort of reasonable clinical conclusion. And he said the maximum settings to obtain 1/2 of your daily dose of noise or music exposure is 80% volume for an hour and a half a day, 90 minutes a day. So your favorite song comes on, turn up the volume all the way, enjoy it, just turn it back down to a reasonable level after. What's reasonable depends on how long you listen to it. So it's not just how loud it is, but how long you listen to it that gives you the dose. There's nothing wrong with 95 decibels, nothing wrong with 100 decibels, as long as you don't listen for hours and hours and hours. A little bit is good, but not too long. It depends on which earphone you use. And he was able to show that with the same volume, same MP3 player, same music, one earphone might generate 84 decibels. That same setting, same volume setting with a different earphone can be over 110 decibels. So all bets are off. Keep it to volume 3. So it's kind of hard to say. And of course, your exposure from a smartphone or portable music is a small portion of your day every day. You're going to drive in the car and somebody's going to pass you with their radio blasting. You're going to go walking past a construction site and somebody's jackhammering. So there's a lot of different sources. Zogby International, this is a little bit dated, but they actually redid it recently. This is a very large study, and Zogby International is a very large polling firm centered in the United States. And they found that when they educated young people, and they surveyed over 1,000 young people, young meaning under the age of 40, and that almost 70% would turn down the volume. It's a reasonable thing, therefore, for me to tell my patients, if you tell them something they don't want to do, they'll do this. And you all know what this is. It's metric for this. It's Canadian. And you don't want them to do that because they won't listen. 42% would listen less often. Again, a very reasonable moderation sort of thing, very Canadian of us, eh? 36% would use special isolated earphones. Isolated earphones are just earphones that go into the ear but also provide some noise attenuation. So when you drive past a construction site, you don't turn up the volume because you're wearing earplugs as well as transducers in your ears. And many people spend more on the isolated earphones than they do on the MP3 players. So how loud is too loud? Well, it turns out that music exposure has some interesting similarities and interesting differences between noise, industrial noise. But it's very similar. We know, for example, from industrial noise, that prolonged exposure to 85 decibels, A-weighted. A-weighted means that you decrease the lower frequencies because most of it's going to hit the eardrum, bounce back out, and never get through to our auditory system anyway. So it's dBA weighted. But 85 decibels after a year of being exposed for 40 hours a day, 40 hours a week, sorry about that, you will be able to measure some measurable permanent hearing loss. Now, 85 decibels is not all that loud. Soft rock, a telephone dial tone. Nobody would think that for those that know what a dial tone is. I know that the youngins today have no idea what that is. For those that have landlines, they have a dial tone. That's 85 decibels. But again, nobody would think that that's all that loud. If it was a broader bandwidth, it might be considered to be louder, but nobody thinks that dial tone is all that loud. MP3 player on half volume, but depends on which earphone you use, so that's maybe a bit. Toilet flushing. Next time you're not feeling very well and you have your head in the toilet and you flush the toilet, it's about 85 decibels. Not that I've measured it. And if you're just standing back and you're urinating, it's 77 decibels.
Some of the institutional toilets are much louder than
Yes,
these
yes.
compressed air.
Things you'll learn.
The
Yeah.
University of Waterloo, they want that blows your ear out.
Calibrated house.
Yeah. I don't really want to go there. So let's turn our attention now, once we're away from MP3 players, to music. There have been a lot of studies over the years. Some are better than others. This one was done with a Scandinavian orchestra back in 1983, Janssen and Carlson. And they found that depending on where you're seated in the orchestra, you've achieved your maximum weekly dose of noise exposure by Wednesday afternoon. So between 10 and 25 hours per week of playing. Now these musicians play every night except for usually Monday. That's usually dark. They might have a matinee on Sunday, but they also teach. They also practice for 3 or 4 hours a day. So they're exposed to a lot of noise exposure, music exposure. And if their maximum dosage is achieved by halfway through the week, that can be a problem for these people. And in fact, it is. I did some work with John Chong. John is a fascinating guy. He's an electrical engineer, got tired of that. Went to work for the National Research Council with Edgar Shaw, got tired of that. Went into medicine, and I don't know if he got tired of it, but he's now a doctor. Anyway, John Chong, I think he was like 20 at the time. He's one of these guys that went to university when he was like 10. But he's a brilliant guy. He's the medical director of the musician clinics. Interestingly enough, he does a lot of the ergonomics. So you get the violinists coming in, and after a while, they ruin their wrist. So he would do a lot of work with biomechanics with them. But we did some work with the National Ballet of Canada during a very, very quiet performance. It was Karen Kane's last dance, and it was more of a practice piece, an etude. And dun, 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 just nothing all that loud. But we found levels starting after the first minute of playing in excess of 85 decibels. And we had levels up to 126 decibels, A-weighted. And this was a quiet orchestra. You'd think that AC/DC or something like that would be louder, but actually an orchestra can be extremely intense. This is the extreme extent. This is the ring cycle, Wagner's ring cycle. It's about 14 hours long. It's never played all at once. There's 4 parts. Usually 1 year they play the first movement, second year they play the second movement, and so on. But what happens with the ring cycle is that the violin section goes home after the intermission, and a new violin section comes in. Just because it's so exhausting to play it. It's arguably the loudest piece of classical music there ever. It's the one that goes dun da da dun 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 da da dun.
Funny song.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that was more Mendelssohn. Without songs number 30. But as you can see, these levels are all in excess of 85 decibels. This is one of the pieces, and I maybe can play the 4th line there. I can't even approach any of the other music, but it's loud. If Wagner would have had amplified music, I'm sure he would have amplified everything as well. He was just into loudness.
It was into distortion before it was a thing.
Yeah. This is some work I did about 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago now. I took 1,000 musicians and measured 1,000 musicians from about 3 meters away. Now my office has a hallway that's 3 meters away, so I was able to do it. They stood there, I measured from here. I threw away the top 25%, threw away the bottom quiet 25%, and just took the middle 2 quartiles. And as you can see, there's still a variation there. This is average playing mezzo forte, not particularly loud or anything, but we had A-weighted levels of normal piano practice up to 90, loud piano, keyboards up to 110. Most of these numbers exceed 85 decibels, even from 3 meters away. A violin, you're right by the left ear, so it's going to be louder than from 3 meters. But all these numbers are higher than 85 decibels. This is what might happen. Now, this is an audiogram. Steve showed you some of the results of hearing, but this is how we measure hearing. We usually plot it on a scale in what's called HL. So it's like SPL upside down. So under earphones, it takes about 7 decibels SPL just to hear that if you have normal hearing at 1,000 hertz. So 7 decibels is just audible on average for normal hearing people. So at 1,000 hertz under earphones, that 0 is calibrated on my audiometer to be 7 dB SPL. Different for the lower frequencies, different for the higher frequencies, such that on this scale, a flat line right across is considered normal hearing. Circles for the right ear, X's for the left ear. I don't know why. But this is a typical normal hearing. We test from middle C, or close to middle C, 250 hertz. We don't test below middle C because it's very difficult to say whether you felt the sound or heard the sound. And any pathology that would manifest itself down here would also manifest itself lower. So going lower doesn't really give you anything that you won't already see down here. But it's fine, fine, fine. Then you're an octave below the top end of the piano keyboard. It's still fine. Then the top note of the piano keyboard, it falls down. And then an octave above that, it's back to normal again. Now, that's kind of weird, eh? And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's in the book, chapter 1. But if it's just aging, this thing would just keep going south. But the fact that it goes down and then turns around and gets better again tells me a lot that either noise exposure or music exposure. And that's because the shape of the inner ear, the cochlea, has a vector, a force vector from the third bone of the middle ear that just jams up against this one location there. So it wears away that one location. Happens to be in the 4,000 to 6,000 hertz region. And then in the 8,000 and 9,000, it's in the lead. So it's protected from the initial onslaught. This is a violinist. Left ear is a little bit worse than the right ear because you're holding a noise generator. You'd see this with drummers as well, with the hi-hats being off to the left-hand side. So this
Monitors
is,
too.
I'm sorry?
They put the monitor there too,
Yeah.
so a lot of the time.
And sometimes it's other guys. So if you see an asymmetry or a difference between the ears, you say, what's going on? And it's that stupid, piccolo player off to your side. It turns out that I'm really not interested in hearing loss or hearing loss prevention. We're all going to lose our hearing somewhat as we age. There are some very happy, successful concert and band players that enjoy their music, but 2 things happen as you get hearing loss. One is tinnitus or ringing in the ears, and the other one is pitch perception problems, where you hear something that's slightly flat. Both of those can be career-threatening. But if we can thereby reduce hearing loss or minimize hearing loss, so that we minimize those other things, the tinnitus and the pitch distortion, then we've done a good job. Yeah, I am concerned about tinnitus, about hearing loss prevention, but primarily because of those other 2 things that can really screw up your enjoyment. There's actually 2 types of tinnitus, and this month there's a trade magazine called Hearing Review. It's free. It's hearingreview.com. Anybody can subscribe to it. I happen to guest edit the January issue of Hearing Review, and there's like 8 or 10 articles there. And I wrote one called Music and Stress. And it's false to think that a 75 or 80-year-old person with a very significant noise or music-induced hearing loss that has ringing in the ears is the same thing that's going on with a 20-year-old that has relatively normal hearing that also has tinnitus. So many people that come in my office, they go to a rock concert and say, oh, my ear's been ringing since 2 weeks ago, and I'm just starting out as a musician. 9 out of 10 times, it's stress. Stress is the big killer. For those of you that remember the 1960s, I know you weren't there if you remember the 1960s, but if you did remember the 1960s, you remember that. But there used to be these headlines in all the papers, stress, the big killer. And they're talking about the kidneys, the liver, the heart, the major organs of the body. And they're right, it does. But also recently, since 2009, we now understand how stress can screw with your ears and your auditory system as well. And I'll come back to that in a bit. But what happens is that if you're stressed, and there's good reason for a 20-year-old musician to be stressed, on average in Canada, the average salary of a 20 to 25-year-old musician is $16,000. You can't really pay your rent. You can't eat. You don't know where the next meal is coming from. There's a lot of problems. We live in a society that doesn't respect musicians as much as we should. There's a lot of real life environmental stresses on a musician. And, they get they have a shoulder problem now because they can't play their fiddle and all these things that, do I have to go into another occupation? And they have all these stresses and their parents are yelling at them, go and get a real job. So these musicians are highly stressed. So stress is a really big killer of the ear as well. And tinnitus is one of the first manifestations of it. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. Because stress is a big issue. So we learned in school that there are two factors affecting hearing loss. One is the sound level in dBA, and the other one is the duration in hours. That gives you the dose. In fact, you can relate them together with what's called a 3 decibel exchange rate or 3 decibel trading relationship. And what that means is that you can be exposed to 85 decibels for 40 hours a week, but that's the same damage as 88 decibels for only 20 hours a week. 91, I'm great at parties, for 10 hours a week. 94 for 5 hours a week. 97 for 2.5 hours, an hour and a quarter for 100. So you can be exposed to 100 dBA as long as it's not more than an hour and a quarter a week. But that will give you the same relationship in hearing loss. So that relationship makes a lot of sense. And we have something, and these are commercially available, and there's actually just one app that's available now that gives you the dose. And really that's what I'm talking about. There's nothing wrong with 100 decibels as long as you're not exposed more than an hour and a half a week with it. And all these calculations is done like that. So it's really the dose, the 100% dose you want it to be under or less than. If you're in a radiation facility, your badge would turn black, but it's just really the same thing. This is from Etymologic Research. Unfortunately, this is not available, but there are hundreds of manufacturers out there that still offer some sort of dosimeter that you can buy from them. There was one up until very recently called SoundLog, and it was upside down. The reason it's upside down, it was made in Australia. No, it is true though. But the reason it's upside down is it forced you to turn it upside down so the microphone would be away from you, aiming at the noise or music source. And so the screen was right when it was held properly. That's the idea behind it. And this is me sitting on my couch eating potato chips. And the levels over time is about 60, 65 decibels. I was watching TV. That's nothing much. And the safe exposure time estimate was greater than 10 hours. That's like 3 bags of potato chips I get. So that is not particularly damaging to it. But then my wife got me tickets to see this guy in the Shea Stadium in Buffalo. And I was at the very back. I was near the front. We could only afford the cheap seats. But right off the bat, the levels were like 100, 110 decibels throughout the whole performance. And my safe exposure time estimate was 12 minutes. So I could be exposed for only 12 minutes before any damage, before I exceeded 100%. I had my earplugs with me, so it was okay. But that's Elton John. Now, they've recently discontinued that. I'm not too sure why. A characteristic of this, though, is that it's only available on iOS. So Android tends to use a compressor that you couldn't completely disable, and it would compress it and give you false readings. So SoundLog was only available on iOS, and same with NIOSH. So the NIOSH is the National Institutes for Health, Safety and Health, rather, NIOSH. It's free. You can download this if you have an Apple phone, an iPhone, rather. And it does give you the sound level meter and also give you the dose. They suggest using an external microphone, but you're okay as long as you turn it around and face it away from you, but the screen's upside down. So you have to kind of keep looking at that. But it can give you the dose as well. So that is still available. But here's the fun part. Well, I went to school and I learned two things about noise. One is the duration, and one is how loud it was. Those are the two factors in decibels. That's it. That's what I learned. And if you put both of those answers on the test, you got 100%. Lindgren and Axelson did the study in 1983, and I remember thinking when I looked at it, what crap were they publishing? I was just graduated as an audiologist in 1981, and this article came to me through a new journal called Ear and Hearing. Ear and Hearing now is considered the best journal for audiology to this day, and it's the official journal of the American Auditory Society. It's really at a high level. It rejects most of its publications. It's right up there with JAZA in terms of rejection rate. And of course, I didn't know who Fred Lindgren or Al Axelson were. I was a snot-nosed kid. These are Axelson's still with us. He's in his 90s now, but at that time, he was considered the #1 epidemiologist in the world. Alf Axelson does not make mistakes. But what they did is that they measured a temporary hearing loss. Now, remember what I said earlier, that you go to a rock concert for the first 16, 18 hours. If I was to measure your hearing, it would be down a little bit. Well, that's what they did there. You can't create permanent hearing losses with humans. You can only do it with animals, one would hope. What they did, they exposed noise and music of equal energy, that is equal duration and equal sound level, to 10 subjects. And then they measured the hearing before, they exposed them to noise and music, they measured them after, they looked at the difference, the temporary difference, right after. And they found that in 4 of the 10 subjects, they had equal temporary hearing losses from the noise and the music. But the other 6, the music seemed to be less damaging. And that was kind of weird. And I said, no, it's the duration and the sound level. They were wrong. But they found that there's something about music that was less damaging. And I remember this article sat on my desk. I would just show it to whoever would listen to it. I didn't understand it. I came across a study from 1970 in German. My German is not great. But with help from my friends, and I was able to get it translated. I'm going to talk about the Horman article at all. Let me see. Let's go back a little bit. How do you go back on this thing? I just got this computer. It turns out that if you are negatively predisposed to something, if you're stressed by something, not only does it affect your heart, your kidneys, and your liver, but it also affects your auditory system. And this was delineated by 2 articles, one in 2009 and one in 2010. And what they showed was this. When you're stressed, high levels of cortisol are emitted from your adrenal glands. Cortisol is a really interesting molecule. It's one of the few that can cross from the body to the brain, cross the blood-brain barrier. Once it's in the brain, cortisol facilitates high levels of glutamate. Now, you may not have heard of a glutamate, other than Chinese food, monosodium glutamate. But it's very much like dopamine and serotonin. It's those neurotransmitter substances. Well, it turns out that glutamate is very important in the auditory system, but low levels are no good. High levels are no good. You have to have a sweet spot in the middle. High levels of cortisol caused by high levels of stress also cause high levels of glutamate. So it facilitates toxic levels of glutamate. And that's what creates the auditory system dysfunction. That's why people that are stressed have more temporary hearing loss. They don't hear as well in noisier locations than somebody that's more calm. There's a number of other psychological and learning reasons for that, environmental reasons, of course. But they were able to show that high levels of glutamate is toxic to the ear, brought about by stress. And at the smallest molecular level, we now know that the effects of loud noise or loud music are identical to the effects of high levels of stress. At the smallest molecular level, calcium ions go into the cell, depolarize the cell, not depolarize in the sense that Steve mentioned it with hyperpolarity, but just causes them to turn off and to malfunction. And so and you have calcium ions, positive ions, going in and just screws with the cells, and you have maybe not hearing loss that we can measure on a hearing test, like an audiogram, but we have auditory dysfunction. The nerves and also the part of the hearing cortex of the brain has dysfunction. And there are some subtle tests that can look at that. So the effects of hating or being stressed about music is the very, very same as being subjected to loud music. And there's a couple of mechanisms here. One's this whole process is called excitotoxicity. You can have the calcium ions go into the cells and kill them. And so there are therapies for each one of these little boxes that researchers and pharmaceutical companies are working on now. Chemical earmuffs or pharmaceuticals that you can take either after or prior to a loud noise or loud sound. Of course, much of this is being funded through the US military because they want their soldiers to still be able to hear the people around them, but they want to give them some sort of protection. So you don't want to overprotect them from the howitzers and the loud guns, but at the same time, you don't want them to lose the hearing. So there's a lot of work. So there's a lot of work being done on increasing the rigidity of the cell walls. And believe it or not, mechanical engineers are just as commonly seen on the floors of pharmaceutical research labs as you see cytologists or other biologists, because they're interested in the mechanics. Free radical, whenever there's any part of our body, we have a metabolism. And we have waste products of the metabolism. That's natural. That's nothing too exciting that's going on there. But when we have a metabolic process, we have waste products. And they're usually double bonded oxygen. And they're the things that are can be toxic. So we call those reactive oxygen species. And so we can take antioxidants to mop these radicals up so that we can hear better. So we do know that if we go to a rock concert, if you ingest things that are high in antioxidants, such as blueberry or certain pharmaceuticals, it will have less of an effect on our auditory system than if we didn't do that. Mitochondria, the damage to the battery to the cell. There's a lot of movements now, very recently, that are moving towards having therapies that based on improvements there. This is an article from a long time ago, but you still see it very often. LNAC. LNAC is a long-standing tool that was always in ERs. If you overdosed on Tylenol, Tylenol is very toxic to the liver. And so the first thing the physician will do is give you LNAC, which mopped up the free radicals in your liver. So we've known about LNAC for many, many years. The problem is we don't really know the dose. And if you look at a lot of the studies, 20 milligrams, 30 milligrams, we don't really know. But at this point in time, there are 406 studies through the FDA in the United States looking at these pharmaceuticals, and hopefully we'll have some that are commercially available either by prescription or non-prescription that will know the dose as well as the benefit, whether they work or not. These are sometimes called otoprotectants, or sometimes they call chemical earmuffs. And I just want to finish off, just 5 more minutes. This is a slide I like. I stole this slide, I stole it. I was sitting in my dermatologist's office, and there was, from the American Dermatology Association, a beautiful poster on the wall, this guy hanging off of a cliff. And the caption was, "This guy's an idiot, he's not wearing sunscreen." So, this guy's an idiot, he's not even wearing hearing protection. Why not? Prior to 1988, and I started working with musicians in the early 1980s, but prior to 1988, there was not a hearing protector that would be useful for musicians. Because of the laws of physics, if you plug your ears, the lower frequency, longer wavelengths are attenuated, maybe 20, maybe 25 decibels at most, but in the higher frequencies, you can have attenuations of 30 to 40 decibels, and maybe a little bit higher frequency, up to even 50 decibels, but that would be in the higher frequencies. So imagine hearing the fundamental slightly reduced, but the harmonic being turned off. So it becomes a low-pass filter system, and that understandably and it would be useless with musicians. And same with industrial workers. They wear these earplugs. No wonder they take them out to talk to their friends, because they can't hear their friends. So that's been a major problem in the industrial field. The one on the left here has racing stripes, and that's a lot better. But that was a problem. 1988 rolls around. This same gentleman I told you about before, Meet Killian with a K, starts a new company called Etymologic Research. This is actually a technology made by Knowles, but Knowles, which makes microphones, they decided that there wasn't a market for this. And Meet Killian said, "Nah, you're wrong." And he, on license, was able to use this technique. But essentially, he acknowledged that the physics is that you're going to lose your high end. Well, why can't he put a disco resonator in the earplug to put back the high end? And it could be a Helmholtz resonance, or in the non-custom one-size-fits-all a quarter wavelength resonance that just put back the high end, such that the net effect was flat. Everything was equally attenuated from a potentially damaging area to about 15 decibels lower. And that was called the ER15. The 15 doesn't sound like a lot. In fact, when you play music, it doesn't seem like a lot. But if you do that exchange rate idea, 3 decibels down, you could be exposed twice as long. Another 3 decibels down, 4 times as long. That would do it down to 6. Another 3D, we're down to 9. Greater parties. Where am I now? 4, 5, 6, 8. ER12 would be 16. ER15. So 15 decibels down, you could be exposed 32 times as long before any damage occurs. So more is not necessarily better. 18 or 20 or 25 is not necessarily better as long as the environment that you're in, you know that very well. And 15 would be most useful. And so that's what that thing came from. This is on the top left, a custom-made version of the ER15. This is a relatively newer version of the one-size-fits-all called the ER20XS. And it's an interesting little chamber here. So the sound comes in here, goes upstairs, down to the second one, down to the third one, back to here. So it's a wavelength, and it gives you has a resonance, a pretty broad resonance between about 2,400 hertz and about 4,000 hertz. So it kind of just puts back the loss, such the net effect is a flat response. This is a measurement of a violin playing A440. So here's the fundamental on the left side, the harmonic structure, meaning that of the violin. I plop on the ER15, I drop a probe microphone in there, and as you can see, it's pretty well parallel to the unprotected form, just take it from a damaging to a non-damaging level. This is a trick I use for all my bass instruments, the cello and the acoustic bass. A lot of them, if you ever go to an orchestra, their necks are awful because their necks are plugged into the neck of the cello because they can't hear the people around them and they can't hear their own instrument. So through bone conduction, they're trying to listen to their own instrument, and they come into our office, like this, and say, something's wrong with my neck. Well, duh. So we fit them with a $5 stethoscope. It's not even $5, it's cheaper than that. I take hearing aid tubing, I plug it into their left ear through a foam plug or whatever they want to use, usually behind their ear. And it's about 4 or 5 feet of tubing. And you can tape it to the back of the cello. You can dangle it into one of the stylized F-holes, or you paper clip it to the tailpiece. That's the black thing where the strings come off. And it gives them a low frequency awareness of their own instruments. This is what it looks like. It gives you a lot of boost there, so they can hear their own instrument amongst all the other instruments. The advantage is that not only is their neck better, but they don't have to play louder to compensate, and so the whole level is a little bit lower up on stage. This is a bass shaker. A lot of manufacturers in the States make a bass shaker. Size of a hockey puck. It's hooked up to your rack. It's about that size. It's designed initially for drummers, where it would be bolted to the vertical seat of a drummer, so that when a drummer hits a sound, boy, is it loud. And with that vibral tactile response, they don't have to hit it quite as loudly. That was the intent, but it can also be bolted to a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, foot by foot. You just place it on the floor, and if you're a bass player, boy, is that a great sound. You really feel the vibral tactile response, and you go up and turn down the volume up on your volume, so you don't have to expose yourself to as much sound, which is kind of neat. Baffles, if you look at a lot of the research on baffles, it's really disappointing in the sense that it finds levels of 0 dB attenuation or 2 dB of attenuation, yet they work. And so a lot of it has to do with how far away they are from the instrument. And unless they're within 6 or 7 inches of your head, they have no effect at all because you're getting reflections off the floor, off the ceiling, off the music stands around you, and other things that are in your environment. But if you also look at them, they're better in the higher frequencies than in the lower frequencies. But if you look at the spectrum of music or industrial noise or most forms of noise, it actually is still pretty more low frequency with very little high frequencies, perhaps with the exception of drummers. Drummers do have most of their energy above 1,000 hertz. So it seems to give you protection where you don't need it, and very little protection where you do. But even if you can drop it by 3 decibels. Now, 3 decibels may not sound like a lot, may not be that noticeable, but now that musician can be exposed twice as long before any damage occurs, if you can just drop it 3 decibels. So far, the big 3 have been moderation, reduce the environmental noise, and hearing protection. And just very quickly, these are three or four tricks you can do, and they work really well. If you have a loudspeaker on the floor, most of them now aren't anymore, but some of the older ones are. A lot of the lower frequency sound would go into the floor rather than out to you in the audience. They had better impedance matching. So just elevate it slightly or even tilt it up towards you, bring it off the floor a little bit, will give you a much better sound so that you can reach up, turn down the master volume. You get the same sound pressure reaching your head, but it's actually at a lower volume. Same sensation of loudness and monitoring ability. And this is an example where the loudspeaker's in the floor and you've lost the whole low end. Well, you know, a good sound engineer would use their equalizer to boost up the low end, but most people would just turn up the volume to compensate for this, to get this up there, and then you're blown out of the water in the high end, nor is it flat. So you do want to elevate the speakers at all. This is, strings should always have at least 2 meters of unobstructed space above them. If you're in a pit, an orchestral pit, Phantom of the Opera, or the opera for that, any show like that, if you're a violinist and you have a poorly constructed absorber of sound just above your head, what happens in the mid to higher frequencies, it's going to absorb the higher frequency harmonic amplitude, and so you're going to have to play harder to compensate, but then you come into the office with wrist and arm problems, and you're playing harder because you want to reestablish the high end, but unfortunately, the person next to you has to therefore play louder, and everyone has to play louder to compensate. If Mozart was here, and I saw him recently, and I asked him this question, Mozart said, well, why don't you just take the stupid violin players, put it out front where there's no overhang, and take us clarinet players and stick it in the back? Because as a clarinet player, when I say it's a good sound, yes, I generate the full spectrum almost like a violinist does, but I don't need to hear the high end. I'm happy with hearing the interresonant lower frequency breathiness below 1,000 hertz. Who cares about the high end? And so I'm sure, so a change of the environment can do this. And in fact, this is a measurement. The red is the original playing of the violin, and the yellow, I don't know if you can see at the back, it eats up the high end. And the magnitude of the harmonics in the high frequencies of any stringed instrument are so crucial to the quality of them. It's the difference between a Stradivarius versus a student model. They really start playing louder to reestablish them, but they really can't. 2 meters of unobstructed floor space in front of the orchestra. This work was done at the Kitchener-Waterloo Theatre in the Square, Center in the Square. Thank you, Center in the Square. Center in the Square, if you've not been there, has the largest stage. This is like 2 NFL football fields on stage. It's gigantic. And so not only do you have the stage, but you have as much room behind the stage. You can take 20 minutes to walk from the front to the back. It's massive. So what we did is that, well, why don't we just move the orchestra back 6 or 7 feet from the lip, 2 meters from the lip. So instead of the conductor just precariously balancing into the audience, just moved everything off backwards, away from the audience. So there was a bare acoustic mirror. And so what happened is that not only did the incident sound comes out, but you get an early reflection off of the floor, adding up constructively at the back. So at the back of the audience, it's sufficiently loud, even though the playing level up on stage was at a lower sound level, thereby less damaging. And it's not frequency independent, unfortunately. It just is more in the higher frequencies. But it's like the pin effect, like cupping your hand like this. You're getting a little bit of enhancement. And the final one, treble brass players, such as trumpet players, should be on risers. And I know there's something called brass mentality, and brass want to be seen, and they love being on risers, so everyone can see them. But if you look at the acoustics of the musical instrument, in the lower frequencies of a trumpet, it's that it's highly non-directional. That is, I can measure with a sound level meter in front of the trumpet player, beside, above, below, even behind. Not much difference in the sound pressure for lower frequencies. But as the frequency gets higher and higher and higher, it becomes more and more and more like a laser beam. And literally the damaging elements are in the mid to higher frequencies of a trumpet. So if you put them on risers, their damaging elements go over the heads of those downwind. And of course, their mothers and fathers get to see them on stage, so it's brass mentality. This is the same argument that you use for the directionality of loudspeakers. You know, if you tilt loudspeakers in different directions, you're going to have not much of a difference in the lower frequencies, but a big difference in the higher frequencies. So it's the same idea. And I think I'm going to stop at that point. So that's another email of mine, marshall.chase@rogers.com, or the info at Musicians Clinic if you want more information or you want PDF copies. If you email me tonight, I won't get to it until midnight, but I'll do it. Any questions? I know it's been a long night, sorry. Yes.
One question. I have a vertigo,
Mhm.
and it's caused by disruption in the ear canal. Is there anything?
Vertigo caused by disruption in the ear canal?
Not the ear canal,
The inner ear, maybe.
the inner ear,
Yeah.
yes. And is there any relationship to that and hearing loss?
No, other than to say that some types of vertigo are associated with an increase of fluid pressure in the inner ear. And that hearing loss and the vertigo can go hand in hand. That's usually called Meniere's disease or endolymphatic hydrops. But usually vertigo is a separate issue. There are a couple that are related. If you have something in the nerve, a growth on the nerve, it can affect both your hearing and your vertigo. But most forms of vertigo are benign. In fact, the number one cause is called benign positional vertigo, where the nerve endings, instead of having a tectorial membrane as they do in the cochlea, have pieces of calcium carbonate or chalk on them. And the reason we have chalk in our ear is that it has mass, so that gravity can act on them, so we know which is down and which is up. Sometimes those pieces of chalk come loose, and so when you move your head, it takes a moment for the chalk to kind of catch up with you. And that can be aggravating, but it's benign positional vertigo, and that usually goes away within about 6 to 8 weeks. But it can reoccur. In your case, there are books that thick on the different causes of vertigo. But it's rare to have hearing loss and vertigo at the same time, unless it's something like Meniere's syndrome.
What was the?
Oh, I'm sorry. First, and then I'll get to you. He had his hand up before. I'm sorry.
I was told some time ago that the reason music is not as dangerous as sound of an equivalent level is that you're expecting the music, and so you can actually have some sort of, those bones can be relaxed in sympathy with the music. Is that still true?
That is true. Just a quick repetition, if you're at the back. He was saying that this was the best talk he ever heard. No, he's saying that music can be less damaging because we have a little muscle in our middle ear connected to one of the bones called the stapedius. It's in here. Chapter 1. And what happens upon loud sounds is that this muscle squinches up, tightens up in the auricular chain, and the sound just does not get through as effectively. If we know it's coming, if you see a cymbal player going, it will naturally do that. Some people, percussionists, naturally phonate just before they hit a rim shot. They don't even realize they're doing it. They go like that, and it does give them some protection. The U.S. Army, however, has also implemented that in that they have a paradigm by which they can subtract 10 decibels off the exposure level from the gun if you know the gun's about to explode, blast. If you don't see somebody doing it, you don't subtract that off. So they have this hazard assessment, and the gentleman that did that, by the way, was called Richard Price. He published that in 1991.
Mercedes-Benz had a system where if its electronics detected that an accident was going to happen, but before it happened, it gave a burst of noise through the radio system.
Really?
To help your ear.
I've never heard that before. That's wonderful.
Yeah, soothing
I
music.
can send you the data.
Interesting. Thank you. I hadn't heard that.
But the risk on the stapedius reflex is not everybody gets the same amount of attenuation.
That is true. If you look in a factory, we do have cases where after 25 years, two guys are working on the assembly line, side by side on the assembly line, same noise exposure, same everything, same hobbies. That guy has a massive hearing loss. This guy has almost no hearing loss, and we think the difference is the function of this trapezius reflex is more active in this guy than in that guy. But
Get my
again,
wife.
we're not sure. Sure.
Follow up to what Pam was asking about vertigo. And there's this thing called the Epley maneuver,
Mhm.
which you can do to sort of shake it, basically taking the bottle of pop and shaking it.
So the Epley maneuver is one of the treatments for benign positional vertigo. John Epley just died a couple of weeks ago. He was an otolaryngologist, and if the problem was mostly in your left ear, you lay on your back, you kind of roll to the left side, have your head shaken vigorously, and it helps. It's like a globe, you know, with a globe with snow. And how do you get the snow down as quickly as you can? It's the same idea. So it doesn't always work with people, and sometimes you have to have several different treatments of it. But the Epley maneuver is a very quick and dirty trick.
I've seen one where you can do it by yourself.
Yep, you can do it by yourself.
You roll back on your back,
Yep.
and then you hold your head in a certain position, and then you
Yeah.
hold your head in the other
Yeah,
position.
it's usually on your bed. You're on your back in your bed. Have your head roll over the side, roll towards the side that you, and then kind of just like that. And yeah, enough of that you'll vomit. No, it might resolve that benign positional vertigo, assuming that's the cause. As I said, there's a book that thick on the different causes, but it's the most common cause. Yes, sir.
Just briefly, you mentioned this resonating thing on the automotive device that puts this sort of like compensation shake.
Uh-huh.
My understanding is, it wasn't that to get rid of this thing called insertion loss, this
Yeah.
function when you stuff something
Yeah,
in
yeah.
your...
Well, so insertion loss would be a lowering, but it would lower more in the higher frequencies than the lower frequencies. So this would put it back up. So you would still want some insertion loss because it's a hearing detector. But you'd want to maybe give you more of a boost in the higher frequencies. You'll still be down below the zero line, that is attenuation, but it'll be a flat attenuation.
Right, and I wanted to confirm that resonator was compensating for that.
Yes,
loss. Okay,
exactly. And there's one for a 15 decibel reduction, and for drummers a 25 decibel reduction. Thank you. Sorry.
In the subway riders.
I just wanted to build on that because there's another thing I didn't mention way back when we were talking about those inner and outer hair cells. I guess we can fry this up. I had mentioned how, these guys are motors and this guy's the sensor. And in the simplified model here, I said, well, nature's A to D's got the inner hair cells form an amplifier. Well, they do more than just that because there is a feedback path here that when you have properly functioning outer hair cells, it actually creates a tighter filtering. It gives you more specificity. You're able to filter things more discreetly. So one of the things you have to be aware of, as you go up in intensity, you start getting into 90 dB. These guys aren't doing anything anymore. They've run out of steam. They've done all their magic tricks are gone. So with a bartender who once taught me his product, because he'd be sitting like this in the bar listening to people and he could hear better. And I go, what the hell's going on with that? Turns out, if I wear musician's earplugs faithfully whenever I go to a pub or something like that, taking that 15 dB of level out brings it back down so the outer hair cells can start doing their magic again and you can hear better.
All right.
And it's like, oh, crap. So the challenge of applying that to hearing aid design is most of the hearing aids today, it's very popular to have acoustically open so the sound's getting in. So we need to go back and closing the ear canal up, and that's got some other problems, which would take way longer than a minute to get
Kind of like squinting in the sunlight.
yeah, it definitely helps. If you guys can indulge me for 1 minute, I just wanted to get a little feedback on something that has value. It's coming out strongly in the hearing aid space, but it's going to be much broader than that. And it's LE audio. I don't know if any of you have followed this. We're all familiar with Bluetooth audio, the classic stuff. That's what you've got. Well, the Bluetooth classic, all Bluetooth stuff is connection oriented, so it's one-to-one relationship. And so when a packet gets sent from the transmitter, I, as the receiver, have to go back and acknowledge that that packet showed up. And so there's this constant handshaking going on. which wastes current. I'm paranoid about current because I'm a hearing aid guy. Along comes LE audio. So LE was low energy Bluetooth LE, which we've had for quite a while, enables much lower power, but it was missing an audio component. The audio component has now been added. And fortunately, there was a consortium within the hearing aid space that was campaigning for the Bluetooth Special Interest Group, the SIG, as they call it. SIG is the ones who make up all these protocols. And we were starting to go down that pathway, and then all of a sudden the mainstream audio guys got interested in this too. Like, they wanted LE audio. And why did they want it? Because this one connection thing was a pain in the ass. Because it truly means one connection. So, okay, you got Bluetooth headphones, great. One receiver, wire it over to both ears, you're done. Wireless earbuds, now you're screwed. Because you're only allowed, technically, to follow the protocol, you're allowed one receiver. So how do you do that? So left and right are coming in one ear, and you've got to get the audio over to the other ear. So some people were using a different radio called near field magnetic induction to beam the audio across, which is fairly efficient. You'd say, well, why couldn't you just use Bluetooth itself? Well, your head, at 2.4 gigahertz, your head is a very good absorber of that energy. There's a reason microwave ovens operate at 2.4 gig. Because fat and water molecules resonate and absorb a lot of energy at 2.4 gigs. So your head is just absorbing that. So you can't send big data across. What some of the clever guys were doing here is like the other ear is freely picking up all the Bluetooth signals around. It just doesn't know which one it's supposed to be listening to because the pairing was done with this ear. So what these guys would do is they would send over the sneak data, follow this channel as it hops around, and do it. Less than ideal. They all got on here because one of the things that LE audio does is it allows you to have a whole bunch of listeners. So yeah, you could even have two ears, but it also means that when I'm streaming my phone, your earbuds, my earbuds, those, we can all listen to the same stream. That is something that's not possible under classic audio. The other application that this was seen as being quite interesting was going to be for assistive listening in larger venues. Some of you probably know you have to have a loop system or an infrared system. For those with hearing challenges, you got to tie it into your main feed. I think in Ontario, it's any venue holding over 100 people is supposed to have an assistive listening system in place. Loop system basically just run a wire around, and it's baseband audio. It creates a magnetic field. In the hearing aid, we've got a little coil. We pick that up. We feed it in. There's a bit of pain in running that wire because all that structural steel in the building starts shaping the magnetic fields, and everything becomes a pain in the ass. We're all hoping LE audio will save the day on that. One of the other things that came out of here that was really neat is it's in the whole world of codecs. Yeah, you could use an MP3, but let's just jump to the chase. There's a new codec that was created by Fraunhofer specifically for this, featuring much lower data rates and much better high quality, better sound quality than the subband codec, the SBC. Now in classic audio, you had to support this guy. But that didn't stop you from, if your two ends knew about aptX or some other nice funky codec that was better quality, you could do that. You can do the same trick in LE audio, but there's probably not much need because the LC3 is going there. You probably won't memorize that. You can just Google audio LE. They got a great website. You can listen to it. Make your judgments for yourself. The broadcast mode is actually being named to Auracast. So what you would have is on every venue that uses a system, there'll be this logo that says, we support Auracast, which is the brand name for the multi stuff. I already said we're going to try and get rid of the loop systems, hopefully. But when you walk into a venue, the question is going to be, how do you know what stations can I listen to? And that's where an app on your phone still comes in, using traditional Wi-Fi and or Bluetooth. And you could scan a QR code that would pull up the reference. The idea is you'll have a visual reference of what programs are available. We don't get it so much in Canada, but certainly when I present in Europe, you'll have multi-language simultaneous translations with your conferences. So it would be English, French, German, take your pick, listen on the stream you want. All those sort of things are being looked at. And what would happen is that once your phone has figured it out through your user interface, you said, okay, I want to listen to this program. LE audio commands go up to the hearing aid, and then the hearing aid listens in to the radio broadcast. Sounds cool. Here's the problem. This is where I wanted some feedback. Last year we had a great meeting about loudness units, full scale, and luffs and lux, as it were. The LU is loudness units relative to full scale. I'm sure many here remember that from that discussion. But you've got a variety of content available around, and people have normalized at different levels. Some of you may know. It was really driven, this creation of the luff scale was driven by the broadcast industry. In fact, it was the US Comm Act, where people were really getting annoyed that commercials were way louder than the program, and they said, screw this, we want a loudness meter. That became the luff meter. We want everything to have the same loudness. At the root of that meter is a very simple filter to roll off some lows, and it emphasizes the highs, but it's measuring the RMS energy. It's sort of a, I don't want to say a dBA scale, but it is a scale like that. So in the US, the magic is everybody must by mandate transmit at -24. So you take your luff scale, you're minus 24. That leaves lots of headroom, because if you run into 0, clip, 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 Marshall's conversation from before, you don't want to do that. If you look at some of these other things like, Spotify and YouTube is an interesting one, because they normalize everything to -14. And I say they normalize it, that's not quite true. What YouTube does is, if you import data, and let's say you happen to work for CBC and you had a content that you had on air, and you decide we're going to redeploy that on YouTube. So you would target it at -24. If you don't deliberately go in and change it, it's going to come out, YouTube will keep it at -24. So what YouTube does is they do a check, they say, are you above -14? If yes, they'll turn it down. If you're below, they don't turn it up. So it's asymmetrical, bit of a pain there. And there's various philosophies there. So one of the challenges, it drives me nuts, Orcast has been branded, we don't have a friggin' standard on what it is, what the levels are gonna be. And you've probably had a chance, as I've been babbling on here, to say, I'm tempted to say, because I am sitting on a standards group that's trying to get this sorted out for the hearing aid space, my gut instinct is to go with like a -24. Because my thinking is, Samsung's racing, I'm sure at CES, they probably already had LE audio TVs out with it. And so the question becomes, if you're built into a television set, your content's coming at -24, why would I want to pick a higher number? Because you're going to have to do signal processing. Remember, if there could be good crest factor, there could be stuff sitting here at -4 dB peak. And if you just amplify this by 10 dB to get to -14, clip, 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 clip. So that would put a lot of signal processing embedded in the transmitter. I think that's kind of a stupid idea. Let the hearing aid do the compression, because we do compression in hearing aids to compensate for your individual hearing needs. And that should not be done at the transmitter. Am I going the wrong way? Does anybody see a problem with it? Because what I'm thinking is, if you wanted YouTube, you just attenuate 10 dB stuff.
Yeah, well, the thing about it is, even YouTube is going to attenuate. If it's music, let's talk about music content. Yeah. It's going to be attenuated anyway. It's going to be much higher. It's going to be in the 16 to 17 kind of range. And that's kind of probably what is going to be recommended.
But YouTube will not move you down to -16.
Yeah,
that had to be a mastering decision.
Well, yeah, I guess so.
If you deliver, here's my proof. If you deliver content at -16, I don't know if you know at YouTube, you can do a right-click nerd stats, stats for nerds.
Yeah.
It tells you what it did.
I think for a venue, the thing that will be hard is having people look at any sort of metering at any point, at any time when they're making a production. To have, like, the thing about LUFS is it doesn't exist in consoles. It's not a production tool yet. Most people don't think that, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to buy a $400 meter so I can make sure the headphones are the right level. And then I'm going to sit there all day and I'm going to watch that meter to make sure it hits that target all day long. It's just not going to happen. It doesn't happen in broadcast, let me tell you already. So it's kind of, and that's where it's more of like a protection thing for people who you're plugging directly into. You know, like it's more about protecting the people's ears that might just have this go off. Where
yeah, I can't have loudness. I can't have levels changing 10 dB.
Yeah, you can't. You just really can't. But that's the fact of the matter is, like, you can't have somebody like let's say this wasn't a venue and you go from a lav microphone to a YouTube video on a laptop or something like that. The operator isn't going to normalize the voice to anything, and the next law that will come out will be hearing assisted comm normalization, because it will be very all over the place unless there's some type of protection mechanisms or AGCs built into before the transmitter even happens.
Okay.
It's tricky.
But in your scenario where you're going from a live lab to you're gonna have some media.
Yeah.
Presumably there's somebody on the console who's making.
Even still, I've never
roughly
seen
the
it
same
perfect
level.
in a theater, right? So then when you think about it as well, it's a very quiet, person at a podium or a lectern or something like that, and then to a direct source. Let's call it an indirect pickup versus a direct source like a laptop or something like that. You're getting your ears blown away all the time.
Yeah.
But it's good to see it's happening. Like, this stuff is cool. Like, this Auracast is a cool thing. I've seen iPhones and stuff that can Bluetooth to multiple Bluetooths, but they have multiple transceivers built into it.
And that's a requirement in Bluetooth Classic, which right now
Yes.
is the existence. There are some LE audio dongles that I picked up from Taiwan,
Mhm.
actually, that do it. The other thing that LE Audio is trying to break is if you're doing classic Bluetooth, you're in for a whole lot of pain on latency, 150, 200 millisecond latency. On LE Audio, it can potentially get as low as 22 milliseconds.
Mm.
But the dongles that I got measured 50. It's like,
It's better. It's half.
well, it's going to be again, if there's any chance of hearing your own voice, 50 milliseconds ain't gonna cut. So this LE audio, there was always this fantasy of could we build wireless in-ear monitors, and the answer is not with 20 millisecond latency. Artists won't tolerate it. So okay, got to shelf that.
You can judge an in-ear pack mix by how far they throw it.
So the other thing I was trying to push a little bit, and I haven't let go of the idea, is say, well, if we can't pick a number, can you send me metadata as to what number you used? Because then I can correct for that. It turns out that they're a little reluctant on that because they're saying the number, despite this being a digital packet, they're saying the number of bits available for metadata is pretty small. It's like, oh, come on.
4 bits. Like that.
Well, the LE audio journey was kind of interesting. They started off doing 7 millisecond long packets, and then they realized that was going to break everything. They had to pad it out to 10 milliseconds, which is what pushed the latency out a little bit. But at that 10 millisecond, then they lost a lot of spare bits, so they could send the metadata at a creep, like 1 bit out of every packet, and it might take 40 packets to accumulate the answer. But it's a slow crawl, but hey, that's better than nothing. So.
Better prospects for ATSC 3.0?
No, hopefully not.
Well, or we just do Dolby Atmos to the ear, and we'll decode it there. All 128 channels. So, thanks for indulging me.
Hey, well, thank you.
As a token of our appreciation,
I believe this is your.
Bone conduction is kind of fun. Some of you saw me. I'm putting it on my eyeball. Like close your eye and put it there. You can actually. It's the freakiest thing that ever happens. For testing hearing, they normally do air conduction and bone conduction. They'll put it on your. But you can take a bone vibrator, play music over it, put it on your eyeball, and you'll hear the music through your eye. And it just freaks you out.
See picture as well?
No, close your eyelid.
as another token
Perfect.
of our appreciation, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
to both of you for coming and sharing your wisdom. It was entertaining, informative, and everything that makes up a good AES meeting. So thank you. Thank you very much. And
Thank you, guys.
I hope you don't encounter any paramedics on the road home.
No. I've known Marshall for so many years that I can almost in a pinch, I could almost get half of his talk incorrectly. But
There's about 8 or 9 copies left over if anybody wants.
Thank you for those. We appreciate that. That's very generous of you as well. Ross, do you want to talk about next month's meeting? What's next month?
Anthony, go ahead.
Okay, next month's meeting is our member showcase. We have all the information posted on the website. Please join us. I believe it's a similar location. It might be. I think it's TMU or it's U of C. So, hopefully we'll see you all there. We're going to present. I think John, you're presenting. Yep. Yeah, and then we've got some other distinguished guests and me presenting. We'll see you there. Thanks for coming.
all right.
And there might be a pizza left, so if you can take an empty box.